glad to have you all here. Salams. I'm going to introduce myself in like 2 seconds, but today we're talking about survivor's guilt and secondhand trauma and kind of grounding it in a lot of the specifically Sudanese population, how it has been impacted over the last year by all of the atrocities in the news, but also a lot of the information is very general. So if you don't happen to be a part of that community, this is stuff that applies to like basically all diaspora communities that have been a part of like suffering spaces this last year. So honored to hold this space with you. We can flip. So I'm Nadia Khensa. I am originally Lebanese. I moved to the US after the 2006 war in Lebanon with Israel, and I have since become a trauma therapist. I am the owner of my own practice called Muruna Healing. I'm trained in trauma psychology, international disaster psychology, and global mental health. And right now I work with Heart to Grow as kind of just like a mental health specialist kind of contractor. And I'm also the author of the poetry collection, Breathing in Spring. So that's a little bit about me. If you want to introduce yourselves in the chat box, if you are comfortable letting us know who you are as you like hold this space. I'm hoping that this can kind of be like a space of connectivity, but yeah, so that's me. So just a little bit about like the plan for today. A lot of the top half is going to feel very like not like jargony necessarily, but kind of like academic heavy. And it's okay. You're going to have access to these slides after, so I don't want you to feel like you have to like memorize definitions and like symptoms and stuff like that, but it's more so just like talking through it so you can really hear the information. And the second half is going to be a lot more about like, what do we build from there? So I'm hoping to spend more time on those things, even though it might feel a little bit dense up top, just to kind of set that expectation. These are dense subjects, it's heavy things. So hoping to kind of, oh, also I use she, they pronouns. I see pronouns in the chat and I should introduce that about myself too. But yes, so we're going to be defining some things about trauma, what symptoms look like, to like, how do you know if someone's in distress, the impact it has on diaspora communities, and then talking about prevention strategies and creating trauma-informed environments. So, yes. I always like to start with just a little grounding space. I know we all just came from different long days, so if you're comfortable, I would like it if everyone could close your eyes for a couple of seconds and bring your attention to your breathing. You don't have to take deeper breaths, but for now, just notice how your breath is sitting in your chest. These are a lot of heavy subjects, so I wonder if you could, as you slowly start to deepen your breath, I wonder if you could set an intention for yourself for today's training. Is there a person or a community that you have on your mind, in your heart? Maybe that person is you, maybe that person is your family's legacy. But I just want you to acknowledge to yourself somewhere as you deepen your breaths. What are you bringing to this space? And are there questions that you have? I also want you to give yourself permission to leave whatever stressors you had throughout your day behind. Focus on the deeper breaths and this attempt to share in community with each other. I'm honored to hold this space with you, and thank you for sharing it with me. And as you feel comfortable, you can continue focusing on your breath. We'll gradually come back to this space. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. And we will start with some definitions about what trauma is. I wonder, I mean, there's so much information out there. I wonder what y'all's experience with these different terms as of right now already is. Do you feel familiar with trauma, secondhand trauma, survivor's guilt, intergenerational trauma? So many words. And you can kind of put in the chat box, like maybe what you feel you understand and don't understand. I'm gonna go through it all the same anyway, but yeah, so we can jump in. So trauma is basically any experience that overwhelms someone's mind and body's ability to cope. A traumatic experience can be a dangerous situation that is physically or psychologically threatening. It could be chronic stress around systemic inequities and ongoing stressors. I think that one is only recently like being talked about. It used to be that we would only define trauma by like the kind of stereotypical like shell shock, like PTSD, one bad thing happened and now like this person has trauma. And more recently, there's a lot more acknowledgement on how those systemic living with long-term stressors, whether it's maybe an emotionally abusive family or like a racialized society or in like financial inequity, on a long-term basis, those lead to the exact same symptoms as someone who has participated in or survived like a war zone. So something to keep in mind. Another big thing is secondhand trauma. That is basically the idea that you can have the exact same stress symptoms and reactions from indirect exposure to trauma. So if you have a close relationship with a trauma survivor, like a family member or a friend, or someone in your community and larger community. So when we talk about diaspora communities, that's a big piece of it, is like seeing what's happening to, in this case, for example, like Sudanese people back in Sudan. That gives you access, like exposure to secondhand trauma, because it's like it's happening to you on some level. And secondhand trauma can have the exact same impact as direct experiences and can even lead to PTSD, complex PTSD. It can cause like a lot of distress for people. So I think a lot of that is happening this year, but we can move on to the next one. So survivor's guilt. I think this is, again, something that is thankfully starting to have more attention around it. And it's the reaction that we have to maybe individuals who believe that they have done something wrong by surviving a traumatic event when others did not. That is kind of a simple way to look at it, but it can look like a lot of different things. So when you take it in the context of refugees, it could be survivor's guilt of someone who successfully left the country where they were experiencing stressors. It can be someone 3 generations later in the like new home, witnessing news in the like country of origin, feeling the survivor's guilt around like not experiencing that to begin with. But it's this like deep-seated like almost anxiety around what have I done to deserve a sense of peace when there's people who look like me, act like me, are the same, like, you know, human being who are having it so much harder. It can lead to intense feelings of worthlessness and shame. People who experience survivor's guilt often feel really unworthy of their survival or their privilege in many cases, and may struggle with self-esteem and self-worth. They may feel weak, they may feel shame. It can have really intense impact. And this is just the definition of it, but I hope to like kind of dive a little bit deeper on like how it impacts people and how to kind of start overcoming it a little bit. The last thing we're going to define on the next slide is intergenerational trauma. And I could give like 7 presentations just on intergenerational trauma. All of these things are so linked together, but to kind of like simplify things a little bit, it's the idea of how our parents' stressors, our ancestors' stressors, they live within us somewhere. And particularly when survivors of trauma don't have the opportunity to heal from their respective stressors, they're likely to keep living in that state of heightened distress, which can lead to a very stressful environment for like offspring. It can lead to like a continuation of those trauma reactions. It basically creates a cycle of trauma where the impact is passed from one generation to the next. And for migrant families, something else to consider is that for many of us, we've been taken out of environments where families have survived and thrived for generations. Even if the circumstances were difficult, there was like almost like systemic survival associated with being in the same place, in the same culture for a long time. And one unspoken impact of colonization is that it bars people in diaspora communities from healing in the same way that our ancestors have instilled in us for maybe generations and generations. Um, just like there's intergenerational trauma, there's also intergenerational resilience and healing. And I think many migrants and refugees and diaspora communities can feel really disconnected from that legacy. And so through the hearing of sad stories and children growing up witnessing and experiencing adult pain, trauma effectively is just passed on to the next generation. Um, and, there are ways to create safe and strong communities and build strength, and particularly the strength of identity. And all of these things are kind of what we'll talk about later, and how to build that intergenerational resilience. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and focus a little bit on how people are experiencing this distress. How are survivors, like, what does the trauma actually look like? So emotional and psychologically, physical health impacts, and there's also social and relational impacts. So we'll kind of go through those things for a little bit. Salams to all of those who are still trickling in. Glad to have you with us. But yes, so just like big picture, when you think about experiencing trauma, and now I'm going to zoom in and just talk about like the secondhand diaspora experiences with trauma, but just like witnessing, picturing the doom scrolling and just the bombardment of like horrendous, outrageous, heartbreaking news day in and day out, it can lead to some really intense emotional reactions in people. Like anxiety and depression, constant worry about the safety and well-being of relatives in conflict zones or unstable regions can lead to this like alertness, this unending like feeling of heaviness. Hearing repeated accounts of trauma from family members or through the news about their home country or country of origin, it can lead to intense feelings of helplessness, sadness, and hopelessness. And these get pathologized as anxiety and depression. And really, like, could you react any other way to hearing these awful pieces of news? Realistically, probably not. And yet it like adds to the trauma to be bringing that intensity into your own life. And it's a part of the traumatic experience, which leads to the post-traumatic stress disorder, another one that I think people are pretty familiar with. But I wonder how many of you can resonate with, again, you're seeing this awful news all day, or in the case of the Sudanese crisis, maybe seeing it be overshadowed a lot all day by people not posting as much, people who are sharing a lot about other things, but never seem to prioritize sharing about Sudan. That can also lead to the same feeling of like helplessness, hopelessness, secondary trauma of like maybe feeling particularly isolated, which is a big reaction that people can have to traumatic experiences, is the sense that you're going through it very alone. It's very common for people to have flashbacks, nightmares, feel hypervigilant, which is basically that like alertness, that difficulty calming down, feeling safe, just in reaction to seeing this repeated bad news about like a country of origin or home. So all of these symptoms can emerge even if you have never directly experienced the trauma yourself. Just hearing about detailed accounts from close relatives, friends, aunts, uncles, knowing intrinsically that it's something that at some point your family had like gone through, because those wounds live in your heart and your like genealogy almost. I mean, it's like, we talk about how like if you speak kindly to plants, they like grow stronger and like faster and healthier. And so thinking about like the impact it has to grow up with generations of people being made to feel small and helpless, It doesn't mean you are helpless. It doesn't mean you can't find empowerment, but it has an impact, even if you were not the one who directly experienced it. So there's tons of emotional and psychological reactions. We can go to the next one. Another big thing is physical health impacts. I think a lot of people are surprised to find out like how strongly stress can impact the body. And particularly, I mean, depending on the age, for any parents that are in this group, children tend to experience stress and anxiety and trauma and depression mostly through like somatic physical symptoms. And that can look like stomach aches, headaches, different like illnesses popping up, gastrointestinal issues, tension, sleep disturbances. And it's, you know, you're not like a bunch of little pieces like weaved together. You are like a whole being. And so when there's one part of you that is feeling like particularly distressed, stressed, traumatized, it affects the whole of you. And so that can also be a clue that maybe you're not doing well. Maybe you feel avoidant, numb, emotionally numb, like was on the last slide, and a hard time connecting to how exactly you're feeling. But your physical symptoms can be a clue to that. If you're having trouble sleeping, if you're having trouble eating, if you're feeling more aches and stomach aches and headaches, a chance to listen to your body to kind of give yourself a clue of something that you might need to care for yourself. The last kind of major way that people are impacted by trauma is on the next slide, through social and relational kind of stressors, particularly when you think about transgenerational trauma in one house. Family members might be struggling with like different levels of trauma processing. That can lead to isolation, frustration. If, for example, the younger generations are like really in tune with all of this new kind of language around like what is trauma, how do you heal from it, but older generations, maybe they had to like bottle things up to just get to the next day. And you know, kind of trying to bridge those two stressors together. It can be really hurtful, especially like also that's just parents, but thinking broadly about community, siblings, friends, just as it can be very isolating to be the person who is suffering and like maybe not being seen, it can also be really hard if you've started the healing journey and you're, or at least it feels like you're the only one in your community or family who has started that journey. That can be isolating in a completely different way because it can trigger injuries along your own journey. It can be really hard to like recontextualize unhealthy family behaviors as like, oh my gosh, they're really struggling, but like they're not doing anything about it. They're just like doing more harm. So it can have a really huge impact on like straining family and community relationships. I just want to pause here for a minute and offer some space for reflection. If you feel comfortable sharing out loud, you can, or you can journal about it for yourself or type it in the chat box, whatever feels most comfortable for you. But I want you to just take a couple of moments to reflect on how your community has felt impacted by trauma this last year. And what has changed? What have you noticed changing within your community and spaces in this last year? I'm also curious for you to reflect either personally or publicly about what are you carrying for your own ancestors in this time? Where is their trauma living in you? And where is their resilience living right now too? So I'll give a couple of moments for you to think about that. I also want to use this pause to ask if anyone has questions about kind of the bulk of information that we kind of just went through together. You'll get access to the slides after, so time. Okay. So, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I really want to like take the time to validate and break down how refugee and diaspora communities are particularly impacted through like these types of traumas, because it's not just the trauma that happens, this like single incident thing. For many people, there's like the before trauma of when you were living in a place, maybe watching it kind of become harder to live in. There's the trauma of actually moving to a different place, the displacement itself. And then there's the resettling, which like all of these, there's like 80 different versions of it. And it doesn't really get broken down like that. It's just like, oh yes, refugee trauma or war trauma or migrant, immigrant, blah, 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 as if it's like so simple. But there's like 8 different points in that single journey. Where you can like be severely impacted. So I just wanted to honestly validate the journey and kind of go through one by one exactly how heavy this is. And for those of us who are experiencing it secondhand, also validating like if you are secondhand, it means at some point, not necessarily, but like in many cases, actually, yes, because like if you're an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants, like at some point, someone in your family went through these types of stressors. And so that again lives in you. Think of the like speaking sweetly to a plant, that like image, and the opposite of that, and how it has been like embedded in your experience of the world. So the first is just like reminding ourselves what pre-displacement trauma can look like. Whether there's exposure to conflict, many refugees flee from regions that have had a lot of violence, whether it's armed conflict, in recent cases, a lot of ethnic cleansing or human rights abuses, financial, like intense poverty. This type of like exposure to conflict is very common. Witnessing or being subjected to political and social persecution based on ethnicity, religion, political beliefs, the feeling of loss and separation from family that either haven't moved with you, family who maybe didn't survive different catastrophes, the forced separation during transit itself. And I also want to highlight how for many people who move to a new place, these exact stressors can be ongoing again. For example, if you migrate to the US, you might again, maybe not to the same scale, but you might again be experiencing like persecution based on ethnicity, religion, political beliefs. And this place that you, which we'll talk about later, but like places that people hoped they would find like a sense of safety in. There is a sense of safety, but there's also like 8 new versions of stress. And so just thinking about how it's ongoing and a cyclical loop. But we're not going to share out loud, but I just want you to like think for yourself about what your family's displacement journey was. Are you the first person who is leaving a home? Are you descended from like many people after someone left your home? But kind of holding in mind at what point in this trauma cycle do you come in, and just kind of using that as your lens for how you experience secondhand trauma. So the next section is displacement itself, like the journey to safety. I think this one is maybe a bit more straightforward, but simply the act of leaving a home can have many dangers. Exposure to harsh environments. There can be periods of time where the fleeing family had lack of access to food or water. There may have been threats from different forces, and different forms of like ongoing violence on that journey. There's also for people who at some point lived in refugee camps, you may have experienced like overcrowded and under-resourced camps that led to even more ongoing stress and trauma, where there was a lack of basic necessities like adequate food, clean water, healthcare, and security issues. And thinking about the cycle of trauma. Again, thinking about how on the other end, like once a person reaches safety because of the intense capitalist society that we live in, someone might be experiencing those things again. You might go from being in an overcrowded refugee camp to an overcrowded apartment. And this is where the survivor's guilt comes in, because it's like, what do I have to complain about? I have a roof over my head. Yes, we don't have much food, but it's so much better than it was before. And it's so much better than these other people who couldn't leave. But it's still not good. And like, your experiences are not measured by just what other people are experiencing. You are your own, like, each individual family is its own kind of micro community and micro experience of like the world. And I think a lot of people, this is where that like survivor's guilt becomes like a trained thing. The like stereotypical kind of immigrant parent coping strategy of like, this is so much better than it could be, so don't complain. And as if complaining, as if naming, verbalizing the hardship is a sign of like weakness, instead of an opportunity to grieve, to like recognize the hardships of the world, to like get closer, to build even more community, and to like identify needs and how things could be better in the future. So that's like, the cycle. And then the post-displacement trauma is a whole other thing, because there's resettlement challenges. Adapting to, even if you move like across the street, it can be stressful. And so imagining moving involuntarily across the world to a new culture, maybe with a different language, maybe the same language, but just like a totally different feeling living there, it can be overwhelming and alienating. And there are many people in diaspora communities that really struggle with a sense of belonging and feeling both disconnected from their like culture of origin and the culture that they're in now. I grew up hearing the joke of like, oh, I'm too haram for my family, but too halal for like my American group. And it's like, I've heard like also many different immigrant communities who have different versions of that. And this shared sense of, once you are part of a diaspora, it's its own kind of identity that doesn't really get named that often, which is another thing that can lead to that intergenerational trauma. Children being born in exile or resettlement or just in a new environment, they're being born into a culture that their parents may know nothing about, and they may be growing up in ways that their parents just like totally don't understand. And so you have these two totally different cultures under the same roof, and maybe not the language just to describe what exactly is happening. And it can be really devastating. But there's also mental health impacts, and also I think a big piece is barriers to mental health care. We talked a lot about mental health, like symptoms and stuff already, but not a lot about like that there's, for many communities, stigma around seeking out mental health support, and also some stigma around like having mental health issues. But there's also like a lack of access to culturally sensitive mental health services. There's a lack of access to affordable mental health care services and appropriate care. And so thinking about the challenge of like, I want to be better, let me go find a therapist. You have to find someone who even remotely understands your culture. You have to find someone who is like competent in dealing with like different identities if they don't share the same one as you, because like, let's be real, they probably don't. And then it's like, oh my goodness, can you even afford them? Because therapy is outrageously expensive. And I'm saying that as a therapist who, I think my services are not accessible for like all price points. So it's like a debilitating, like systemic issue for many people. I will be giving resources at the end for affordable mental health care. You're going to get like a little handout with different things that you can look into. Also, Heart has like a service right now, which we'll talk more about later too. But yes, we can just take a deep breath. That was like a lot of the heavy stuff for today's presentation. So I just want us to take a couple of seconds to recenter. And if you can, I want you to try to remember the intention that you set. at the beginning of this presentation. If you're trickling in now, I see some people are coming in and out. I invite you to set an intention for how you want to use this space and use this time. We're going to be focusing a bit more on like how to grow from trauma in the next couple of for the rest of the session. So, all right, we can move forward. So part of the steps to, and it's not formulaic, this is like suggestions, but everyone is an individual, but these are things to think about in how to prevent like getting crushed by secondhand trauma, how to prevent secondhand trauma from turning into PTSD, how to like start the process of growing your community from the bottom up. So it starts with
Nadia, I think we lost you for a second. Do you want me to continue?
oh, am
Or
I,
could
can you hear me?
I think you're good now. I think it like froze or something for a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, that's okay. It was on an introduction slide, so that feels like a good time. We can move on. But the first step to kind of building your community, building yourself, restoring your community from the ground up is by addressing survivor's guilt and normalizing those feelings. I mean, I heard some of this in the like comments earlier, but like what survivor's guilt can sound like, that feeling of like, what do I have to be sad about? I'm not even going through anything. And why am I so weak? Like, look at what these other people are going through, and I can't even send an email. And this really intense negative voice. And survivor's guilt is a common experience and not a sign of weakness. And you need to allow yourself to feel your feelings and find spaces to process them. And normalizing your feelings doesn't just happen once. It's something that is a daily process, and it's the way that you go about processing and normalizing your feelings also changes on a day-to-day basis as things change. Ultimately, healing is about understanding your past, acknowledging the trauma and the impact that this displacement has had on you, on your family, acknowledging the impact of like witnessing what's happening to other communities, and being honest with yourself, telling yourself the truth about your owning your honest experiences is an important aspect of healing. It helps others to understand and acknowledge the history, the trauma, and pain. And it also shows future generations that it's okay to speak this truth openly so that there is no more shame, guilt, fear, or racism. Are we having technical issues?
I don't know where Sabrine went. I'm like, oh no, I see Sabrine. Never mind.
I'm so sorry. My internet just
That's okay. I wasn't reading from the slide in that moment anyway, so I mean, it's fine. Yeah. Since we're resetting, I also just want to take a moment and see if anyone has thoughts on the stuff that we've talked about the last couple of minutes, and really just addressing survivor's guilt. Let's address our own survivor's guilt right now while we're setting up shop again. How has that looked for y'all this last year? Have you felt an increase in those kind of negative thoughts about you, about your own experiences?
Salam, everyone. I was just gonna like I've been thinking a lot about like survivor's guilt, and this is not funny but kind of sad, but I was talking to my cousin who like she was telling me, she was like, man, like, what I miss? Like my favorite jacket. Like I miss like my clothes. And she's like, I don't have access to my clothes. And I then was gonna go out and I had done all my laundry and I went into my closet and I was like, I didn't there just started bawling because I was like, I have my favorite jacket, and I was able to like have all this selection of my things with me and being able to see them like live out of a suitcase and miss like hearing her being like, I was known for like wearing so many cute outfits and now I live in these like five clothes. Was just like really hard and I didn't realize how like it can show up in the smallest of ways. Um, yeah, so that's kind of what I want to share. But thank you so much for this. It's been great.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's incredibly powerful. I think it really shows, yeah, exactly, the small things. Is someone else
My
wanting to?
network is not that great. Kieran, Anita, you guys mind sharing? I'm literally on hotspot right now. I have no idea what happened.
And I can if you can't, Anita, but would you mind doing it?
Yes, I can do it. I just
Thanks for y'all's patience with us. No one can control internet access, so decolonize our expectations around presentations. We do not control the internet, so yeah. But thank you so much, Iman, for sharing. I think it really shows how much like every aspect of a person's being can be impacted by those kinds of changes. And that's like a really powerful example of the survivor's guilt too, how your own like experiences with privilege, having a jacket that you like is nothing to like feel guilty about. And yet when you have like loved ones who can't have their things anymore, it's really hard to hold space for both. I see a hand raised. Please, you may speak. Shah.
Yeah, hi, Salam. Yeah, I guess I have a question that's come up for me because like I experience survivor's guilt a lot. And I have most of my life, but I feel like since the war and since my family's had to evacuate, it's like almost, a daily experience and in all these small ways. And I feel like it can be like really immobilizing. Like I can move, like be frozen in my actions because I just start to feel guilty and I don't know where to direct my energy. Like I won't, I won't be able to like feel my feelings because I feel guilty about those feelings. Or, I won't be able to like move into a space of action around those feelings. So I'm wondering if you have any tips or thoughts about how to move past the survivor's guilt into like action or self-soothing or something.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about coping skills for self-soothing in a minute when we get the slides back up. But I also just want to start by saying that when we try to suppress our emotions, what we're really doing is creating like an echo chamber in our mind where that feeling is just like bouncing around endlessly. And so instead of moving past it, how you want to like go do something else, maybe something that feels more supportive or productive, you end up ruminating on it because instead of letting it out, you're like forcing it in. And so that's particularly why it can be so important to process your feelings, to find spaces to like name what's happening for you and how it's impacting you. Because when we express something, whether we say it to a friend, whether we journal it for ourselves, or even just acknowledge it, we are taking it out of our mind and putting it somewhere where we can see it with a different part of our brain, with a different part of our mind. And it gives us a chance to challenge it, to work on it, and to work through it. And so there is the like coping component to it, which we'll talk about, but this is why I want to empower you to like really confront the feelings that you don't want to, because when we don't, they don't go anywhere. We can't delete feelings. They might just go hide in corners that we don't know about and like weigh us down in ways that we can't even articulate. But thank you for asking that. I hope that was a helpful answer.
Yeah, it was. And so you're essentially saying like a good way to feel your feelings might be like talking about it, right? Like talking to somebody, journaling maybe. I'm like trying to
journaling.
start journaling some more again. Okay.
And also just like acknowledging if you feel like the shame or guilt or embarrassment that's making you want to suppress it, just like giving yourself permission to feel it too. So we can move ahead a little bit. Another one, and one more. Okay, here's where we were. So here's the part where we're going to start talking about like how to grow from these experiences, or not grow from these experiences, more so grow because we like literally have to, and these experiences are happening whether we want them to or not. So a big important thing is the idea of cultural resilience and decolonized self-care. I think we all hear about self-care a lot. I think we are, as a society, moving past the idea that like self-care is bubble baths and nice smelling candles. Sure, those things are nice, but they don't do anything for these types of like communities, for these types of pains. It's like so the idea of decolonized self-care. First, I want to like acknowledge that like caring for yourself is not self-indulgent, it's self-preservation. As Audre Lorde said, it's an act of resistance. It's an act of like reclaiming yourself and your community. One of the reasons that caring for yourself is so important is because it increases your capacity to care for the other people in your community. And like you are enough, but also we're talking about like collective suffering. And so like the answer has to entail like collective healing as well. And so the act of starting with you puts you in a better position to like help the other people as you see fit. But decolonized self-care is a holistic process that we all need in order to foster presence, engagement, wellness, and self-love. Self-care is not a singular skill, but it is a wide variety of tasks tailored to meet like an individual's diverse set of needs. There's not one thing to do for self-care, but I want you to get engaged with the practice of noticing like what makes you feel more full, what makes you feel more whole, and leaning in towards the things that like give you and marginalized communities those like more positive experiences, and leaning away from things that just exacerbate the pain. We can go to the next slide. There is a lovely organization that I found called the Healing Foundation. They are an Indigenous group in Australia that does a lot of work around transgenerational trauma from like the indigenous people who survived colonization there. But there's this lovely quote that I wanted to share with you that culture is strength. Practicing culture through activities like connecting to or creating art are powerful ways that we can process our experiences in a safe environment and find strength when our reserves are running low. If you're alive, that means that there are so many people who survived before you for you to have gotten to this point. And I want you to like engage with yourself and ask yourself, like, how did they do it? What were the things that our families have done forever that like helped them get here? And if you hear a negative voice in your mind saying like, they didn't do anything, my family like didn't process anything, like I don't feel resilient, it's okay. Just like acknowledge the feelings that come up, but I want you to really challenge yourselves to explore like what has healing looked like for your community, for your like culture, and is there a piece of that that you can start integrating into how you experience your own wholeness. Thinking for my own personal experiences, when I remember my like time in Lebanon, most of my family had, I mean, I was the youngest cousin by like a lot. So most of my family had experienced the Civil War in the 70s and 80s. And I just remember so much joy, so much like family gatherings where they were like dancing debke and like reciting poetry together. And these deep-rooted cultural practices like echoed through their chests and echoed through my memory. When I remember like what it was like to live in Lebanon, I remember those aspects. That may not be everyone's experience. Not everyone has like healthy or like, you know, comforting families. but you're not just your family. And there may be other communities, there may be the ideas of chosen family that also inspire some sense of resilience. But as we're like witnessing so many different cultures being squashed and pressured into silence and feeling smaller and smaller, one way to heal, one way to like overcome that is to make yourself bigger and bigger and own the things that are trying to be like pushed out of you. So for many people, that can be art, that can be food, that can be dance, music, language, and other things. I mean, those are honestly the things that have been helpful for me, which is why I'm saying them, but those aren't the only important pieces of culture. Religion, faith, spirituality, specific traditions or cultural practices. These are how our families got to wherever we are today, whether we love or hate where we are today because of it. This is how there were enough family to bring us here. And so what of that are things that you can pick up for yourself? I would be interested in your reflections on that, but we can move forward for now. And that's all like fine and dandy, right? Very ooh-woo fun stuff. And the real stuff is also finding ways to like build a sense of empowerment and agency in your communities, because that is ultimately where our like onus of control is. Thinking about where are you right now? Are you in a predominantly like a homogenous community with people who are like you? Do you feel more isolated? Are there only a few of you? Are you still like wherever you are, just like taking stock of what your community is and what is the power that you have in that space. We have the ability to like, as one, we are small, but you know, when there are many of us, we are just bigger and bigger, and using that to like find a sense of advocacy and agency. That can look like finding what resources are available for you in your community to heal, compiling those resources, making them available for the people around you, and providing people with consistent access to those outside resources that can lead to empowerment and restored dignity. You know, if I may, I'm going to reference that like story of our participant who shared the story about their cousin and not like having their nice clothes anymore. It's so often that when there's like clothing drives for refugees, like a lot of people use it as a chance to throw their trash away. Use that as a chance. Maybe you buy a new jacket and like donate that. Give people something that they can like feel proud in, something that they can feel like themselves in, instead of this idea of, and I'm sure like people here probably don't think that way, but this like pervasive societal idea of just like, well, they should be grateful for anything that they receive. That doesn't have to be true. Why not give something nice? And, you know, if you have a community that is, for example, doing a clothing drive, this is a like part of agency that you can kind of take a sense of control over these traumas with, sharing those stories, giving people something to think about, like even something as simple as like encouraging people to like donate things that are like good quality and nice and gently worn can make a huge difference in both the person receiving it and also how your community is like processing the idea of like giving and receiving help. So empowerment and agency, yeah. So now kind of shifting to creating a supportive environment. This is going to go over some of those like coping strategies for when we're feeling really like intensely alert, and also just different ways to continue feeling connected and finding ways to feel a sense of hope. So we can So, a term I like to throw around is relative safety. I'm going to throw one more big definition at you guys for today because I think this is so important. It can be really hard in the year of 2024 to feel like anywhere is safe. Everything feels very heightened, everything feels very dangerous at times. And the idea of safety is like, it feels almost like this like silly, nonsensical, privileged idea at this point. But I want you to give yourself permission to zoom in metaphorically for a moment and rethink the idea of safety as the question of like, am I and are my loved ones like safe right now? So instead of this big picture of like, people hate Sudanese people, people hate Palestinians right now, like we're being attacked, we're being disenfranchised, all of these things are true. And they do lead to that deep sense of like a lack of safety, that deep sense of hypervigilance. And if you live with that feeling, it can really overtake you. And so part of this is empowering you to find ways to like make that feeling smaller so that you can like focus on the things that are important to you. And with that, it's like the question of like, am I safe right now? And maybe you are home with a meal with your loved ones all around you, and the stressors are on your phone, they're outside the door, but they're not with you right now. And so in those safe spaces that are really zoomed in, what can you do? How can you like prioritize like the sense of calmness? How can you prioritize like action that you want to take? And how can you allow yourself to like use those like spaces of relative safety to start unpacking those big, heavy feelings? Calmness is a big thing too. We don't have to be happy all the time. This news is distressing. And if we're living in that space of distress all the time, my gosh, you can't like breathe. And breathing is really important. So just like reminding yourself like ways to self-soothe, ways to just calm down so that you can even digest the information that is important to kind of digest. So we're going to talk about specific coping strategies to help like calm down the nervous system. We can go to the next slide. Here's a few different examples. I'm going to kind of talk through them. You're going to have these slides. So again, just like take it in, don't like panic. I want to take this as a moment to talk about like how important breathing is. And I'm going to start by saying exactly what happens when our bodies are feeling overwhelmed. So you're scrolling, you've just seen the 27th outrageous, horrible thing that you couldn't imagine in a row, and you start to panic. Oftentimes what can happen is as we're becoming more stressed, our breathing becomes more rapid. As our breathing becomes more rapid, our heart rate becomes faster because our brain needs more oxygen. And so like our blood needs to pump faster. And so as our heart is pumping faster, we start to feel anxious, we start to feel nervous, we start to feel like all of those intense things, because that's the same thing that you feel when you're in danger. So taking a moment when you notice yourself in that heightened state of distress, to slow your breathing down, slow the central nervous system down. It can have the exact opposite effect too. As we slow down, our brain gets more oxygen, our heart slows down to a normal pace again. And just as like the quick breathing made us like lose control of our thoughts, the slow breathing like puts our thinking hat back on literally in our brain. And it helps you, instead of like reacting from a place of like impulse, reaction, fight or flight, it helps you kind of like remind yourself of like the rational thinking process. So that's all easier said than done. I mean, it's a good practice to like when you feel stressed, just remind yourself to take a deep breath, because then when you feel a lot of stress, you've already built the muscles. But there's a couple of coping strategies specifically in this little square that I think are very helpful for those types of stressors. So my favorite one is the 5 senses coping. This is, again, car accidents are like so easy as an example. I'm so sorry if that's like someone's specific trigger, but I think it's like the best like kind of one-time big trauma to conceptualize things. So I do tend to use it as an example a lot. But like, let's imagine that you were just in a car accident. Don't imagine it too hard, but just like think about it. And like you're getting stock of yourself and you are like, your heart is racing. You can't really like orient to where you are because like your body is in shock. Take a deep breath. Name 5 things that you can see. You can see that the front of your car is like parked and not dented. You can see that there's like, you can see that your purse has like tipped over, but it didn't fly through the window. You can see, the tree outside. You can see your favorite grocery store outside of the other window. Name 4 things that you can hear. Okay, you don't hear, you hear the wind rustling. You hear the person like breathing in the car seat beside you. You hear the music still playing on your radio. Okay, 3 things that you can touch, whatever is around you, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. The idea behind this is that when we are in shock, we lose sense of like where we are. Even if we aren't like thinking about it like that, like your body is confused, your body's in shock, and it doesn't know where you are. Just like how when we're breathing fast, our brain is like shutting down. This is one of the things that happened. So just like no matter what's happening, just like the ability to like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, take stock of your surroundings, pair it with intentional breathing is a good way to kind of when you feel like a sense of panic. So that was car accident, but now just thinking in terms of like heightened stress, panic attacks, other like, I like literally have been doom scrolling all day. I can't look away and I like don't know what to do. Just pause, take a couple of deep breaths, orient yourself to your surroundings. I've known some clients who started carrying around like a tiny perfume that they liked the smell for, and whenever they felt stressed, they would just like wave it in front of their face as a way to like bring them back to the present. And most of these are about just like bringing yourself to the present. So I like that one because it's easy to remember, but you can kind of read through these. You can also like Google, YouTube them and like have walkthroughs, but for now, we can move to the next thing. You'll have access to this, but just like quickly conceptually, in terms of like coping, this isn't like long-lasting self-care strategies, but it is like how to cope with distress. I just really like thinking about like the 5 senses, like healing with the 5 senses too. When you like are distressed and don't know what to do, it's cyclical. A lot of the time we're like, I'm sad, I don't know what to do. But like, again, you're not like a bunch of little parts, you're one whole being. So if you don't know how to soothe the emotions, maybe there's things about your body that you can soothe, like hugging a soft blanket or using taste, eating like something sour. I actually keep a tin of mints in my desk, and between sessions, when I've had particularly a stressful session with a client who's like carrying a lot of distress, I'll chew an Altoid and just like feel the burst of like flavors, and it like is a way of grounding myself. And thinking for you, curating for you, almost like having it around you, what will help you feel anchored, grounded, calmed throughout different like kinds of distress. And almost looking at it as like a personalized toolkit for yourself. Yeah. Smell is really powerful. I also love the idea of like smells. So, I invite you to kind of make a list for yourself of like, when I'm stressed for each of these categories, what's something that I could like give myself access to just like ground myself. Yeah. Sometimes I go touch my plants to calm down. Me too. I love my plants so much. Between sessions, I'll just look at them and they make me happy. So, all right, we can move to the next slide. I want us to start thinking about the idea of connectedness. So, I keep bringing this up because no one can heal alone. Our injuries happen as a collective, and our healing has to happen as a collective too. I want you to understand what your limits are and the limits of those in your community. Healing is about community-led healing initiatives, about embedding cultural practices into programs that work for you, whether it's like an actual program or whether it's just like a function that you and your people do together. It's about self-determination. It's about like encouraging a better future for you and for the people around you. connection is a huge piece of healing, especially for diaspora communities, because it fills that sense of like isolation that many people in diaspora can feel. You're not alone. You're not alone at all. There's so many people who feel exactly the way that you do. And the ways that you feel differently from other people can be a strength in those spaces, not a weakness. And, you know, it can also be really powerful to observe how you and your community have different reactions to the same traumas. Instead of that being a weakness, earlier we talked about the idea of isolation, being the only person who's on the healing journey. Maybe at some point it can be a strength. Maybe there's a way to grow from each other's perspectives and experiences and the different ways that people react to the same traumas. It's a journey. But I just want you to like have the idea of connection and staying connected in mind. So, because that's a big part of how we break the cycle. We've been talking about intergenerational trauma all day, all hour, and it doesn't just break. And maybe you can break it for yourself, but when you work on yourself, this is like, again, I've said this already, you matter. If you're the only person in the world that you help is yourself, that means that you like saved one person, and that is so much more powerful than you could ever like fully understand. But you matter, and if the person you help is you, you've done enough. And when you build your strength, when you build your resilience, when you learn healthy coping skills, when you learn healthy communication skills, you are setting an example for the people in your community. When you work on your reactions to stress, you're better able to sit with other people's stressors. That doesn't mean you have to be a martyr for like everyone in your family, but it is a reality that like if you can process it so that it doesn't get to you anymore, you can set a healthy example for the people around you of like what positive change can look like. And it's hard. It's hard work. It may feel impossible. It may be impossible to like retroactively like help people before you in the cycle of trauma. But if you break the cycle of trauma, then you get to like build healthier communities moving forward, if nothing else. So feel your feelings. And the last and biggest piece of this is the feeling of hope. With these huge traumas, there is a period of grief of accepting that your life or the life of people in your community has changed. And this can be an opportunity to set goals and norms and wishes for your collective future and lead to what is called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is the reality that when you go through horrendous hell, you can come out on the other side. You can grow from the experience. You should never have had to go through it. There's all of this like, you know, toxic positivity on the internet around like being thankful because your trauma brought you here. You do not owe your trauma anything. You do not have to be thankful to it. And both things can exist at the same time. You can realize tremendous things about yourself as you learn to hold space for all aspects of your experience. And it is possible to like learn how you want to be moving forward and have new goals and values that you never would have thought of before. And with hope, there's this idea that, you know, healing is future oriented. If you I mean, it's complicated, but I mean, if you think about it, like healing is about embracing and celebrating and acknowledging and breathing and embedding yourself and your culture into like everything. Especially for diaspora communities where like just being yourself has been so challenged and so like hard. To me, part of like having hope for the future is the hope that like your community can one day be happy. You can like have a community where people are being happy, healthy, singing, dancing, celebrating, and feeling a sense of peace, being nurtured, connecting and honoring and respecting like the land that you're on now, and like building a new sense of home and like hope for the future. When that is, who knows, at large, but it is possible for you to like build that for the community that you have now. When we think about survivor's guilt, someone worked really hard for you to survive something. Maybe that person was you, maybe that person was your grandparents, maybe it was someone else. And instead of minimizing your experiences, you have a chance to like build on that. Like how can you like create the like holistic happy community that maybe your ancestors, maybe your parents, maybe you dreamed of when you were on your displacement journey. And then if more people enter that diaspora community, instead of like that feeling of being lost and like confused and sad, there's like roots. There's a system of like empowerment and structure that they can like hop right into. And this is like also part of breaking that larger systemic cycle, is accepting that like sometimes you're the one who needs to start like building the type of community that you want to see, and you have it within you to do that. And so as one of our last reflections, I do want to invite anyone who has thoughts on post-traumatic growth, and if you've seen it, if you've experienced it in yourself, what your thoughts about it are, and just want to open a little discussion for the rest of our time together. And also want to thank everyone who's been active in the chats, who's been listening, who's been here with us. I appreciate you all.
I joined in a little bit late, so I think around 12:45. So maybe yeah, I've missed the bits and pieces, but what you were saying about post-traumatic growth kind of reminded me of something I think maybe Shaw was saying about like freeze, and like, or like being in a state of freeze where you have all these feelings and you're trying to move with them. And I think that for me is a little bit of like, at least that's what I'm taking it to me, in a sense of like moving with the feelings, and like, yeah, and also what you were saying about like processing, and not suppressing, but like showing up as those feelings are there. And so grieving in the ways that needs to be, and then just like finding outlets and movement, like moving with, as opposed to like being stagnant with those feelings. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. I don't know if that makes any sense, but for me, that is one takeaway, or that's what this idea of post-traumatic growth is like, I think a lot of these things are cyclical, and I think for me personally, I think I'll come back to them continuously, but it's just like, yeah, like moving with it, or trying to move